Let me welcome you all. Welcome to Second-Ponce Baptist Church. Thank you all for coming for this special evening. I'm Doc Hollingsworth. I'm senior pastor of this great congregation, and it's an honor to say welcome to so many from the community who have made this night a priority. This night is part of a four-part series we're doing at Second-Ponce on the intersection of race and faith. Our own David Hull started us off last Wednesday night, the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's assassination, with a Bible study and a theology of race that was just brilliant. And last Sunday, Taylor Branch, the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian who wrote the definitive 3-volume work on the King years, he was our guest in worship Sunday morning. And next Wednesday, Natasha Reed Rice will be our guest. Natasha is the associate pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church and also in-house counsel for Habitat for Humanity, a younger voice in this movement. And so I hope you can be with us next week too. Before we thank tonight's guest, I want to bring one word from our sponsor. We do have a guest table out in the foyer, and if you are in Atlanta and do not have a faith home, a place to worship and serve, this is just as fine a one as I know, and you would be welcome here. And if you would like to know more about the ministries of our church and the ways we're trying to serve Atlanta, I hope you'll stop by the table when it's over and get to know more about the ministries here. We've included a short biographical sketch of Ambassador Young in your worship bulletin because if I introduced all of his accomplishments, you all would be late getting to bed. So I don't want to do that. I want to jump into our conversation, but our conversation tonight is about the role of faith and church, the Christian experience as it related to the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement has been chronicled in 1,000 different ways. We're going to try to stay in our little corner of the story, and that is, how has church, faith, the leadership of God's Spirit informed this magical movement? So, with that, would you thank our distinguished guest for his being here? Thank you. And I thank you, sir. I mentioned already that Taylor Branch was with us this past week, and he told us at lunch more about the documentary the two of you worked on together, King and the Wilderness. It aired on HBO last week, I think.
I hope they use it again because it's one of the best documentaries that has been made. They took a lot of time, spent a lot of money, and I should plug. We have a program called Andrew Young Presents, which is quarterly on WSB. Usually it's about 5 o'clock on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon, but we only do one a quarter, but we managed to do 4 a year, some on the civil rights movement, some on what's going on in Africa, some on current events, and I find that documentaries like that help you feel the story better than just reading it or the still pictures in the news. A picture, especially a motion picture, if a picture's worth 1,000 words, I don't know what that makes a motion picture worth. But Taylor did a very good job of research, and of course, he knows the subject very well. And though I always remind him that when we were in Birmingham, he was still a student at Northside High School. And I was the one out there with the dogs and the fire hose, which really wasn't that bad. No. You know, on a hot summer day, a fire hose was you know, especially if you got behind a tree and just got the sprinkles and well, it was bad, but that wasn't really one of the worst times. We were pretty much in control of that time.
Well, I want to go way back. Grew up in New Orleans, then Howard University, but then your first inklings call to ministry came at Kings Mountain and Lake Brownwood. Would you tell those stories about how you first started getting a sense that God was calling you to vocational ministry?
Well, my father was a dentist and my mother was a school teacher. And so I lived what you'd have to call a privileged life in New Orleans. But my father always wanted me to be a dentist and be a baseball player. And, you know, growing up in the city, he grew up in the country, in Franklin, Louisiana, and sort of had played baseball to kind of pay his way through dental school. But I knew I didn't want to be a dentist, but I didn't want to disappoint my father. So I ended up, after graduation, coming back home, we stopped. They were good church people. And there was a church conference in North Carolina at Kings Mountain. We also didn't have much choice because there were there were no places where black travelers could stay in a hotel on the way back. So we deliberately planned to spend the night at the church conference center in Kings Mountain. Well, they went to the church conference the next day, and I didn't really want to go. And I didn't need anybody telling me about God. I needed to find out who I was. And I'd been on the track team and the swimming team at Howard, so I was in very good shape. And I wish I had a church like this near me where I could get in your swimming pool regularly. But I went out running, and I started to the top of this mountain. And I just kept running until I got to the top, and I was completely exhausted and could hardly breathe. And in kind of coming to my senses and looking out, it was the only thing, nearest thing I had to a religious experience. I didn't hear any voices. Nobody called my name. But just looking out on the cornfields, and there was somebody growing sunflowers, and the clouds and the mountains and the road. I mean, everything seemed to be in place. And it just hit me. The God who made all of this and everything he made that I see has a purpose, there's got to be a purpose for me. And it was just a sudden realization that, a conviction that anybody who would make an earth as beautiful and organized, and I had studied sciences, so I knew a little bit about the solar system, and I had majored in biology and chemistry, so I was scientifically oriented toward the enormous miracles of this universe. And I said, it's just unreasonable that God would fix everything and put everything in place and not have a place for me. And I came down from that mountain not knowing what that place was and not caring, but just saying all I have to do is do the best that I can one day at a time. And God's got to have a purpose for me. And if I do the best I can one day at a time, it'll happen. And that's the way I've really lived.
So that was after Howard, though? No inklings of calling at Howard? Or?
The only inklings of calling at Howard was that I'd go down to the Library of Congress, and I'd always check out the philosophy books. And I started reading Aristotle and Plato, just on Sunday afternoons in the library. And but I didn't like church. and I liked the people in church, but I didn't like the image that I had of Christianity. But see, I was also just 19. I went to college very young. Back then, they pushed you along. And so I graduated in 1951. And so I was in college at 15 to 19 with all of the guys coming back from the military with their stories from Second World War. And but I went to chapel, but all I can remember from chapel is the choir singing the benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. You know, and the Lord be gracious unto you. And that's the only reason I went to church, because I don't remember a single sermon.
You know that hurts my feelings. I mean, I hear that every week. They come by the door and tell me how good the choir was. But all right, we can do it.
Well, no, and I'm a victim of that myself.
But you knew you didn't want to be a dentist, but you graduated college. If you didn't love the church at that point, what motivated a move to seminary?
Well, I think of my life as a divine accident, but divine in that God ordered it. My church pastor went into retirement. He was in his 70s. And one of the, and I didn't have any relationship with him. But as I was graduating, he retired, and the new pastor came in from Yale Divinity School. And again, I was 19, but he was just 26 or 27. And he had experiences in an interracial church in the United Church of Christ in New England, and had been invited by the World Council of Churches youth department to lead Bible study out in Texas. And he said, look, I'm from the north. I'm really uneasy driving around the south. Would you drive with me, go with me out to Texas to this conference? He was leading Bible study. So I said, sure. And again, I was conflicted because I wasn't going to go with him to the Bible study. It just happened that I thought that the conference was near San Antonio, which is where my college roommate happened to live. And I was thinking about going there to party with him. But it was near San Antonio, but in Texas, near is about 200 miles. And this was 1951. And from the time we left Houston to the time we got to that conference, we did not see a single black person. Now, they might have been around, but I had never been in the all-white South before. And I understood him being nervous. And when we got to this church camp, we were the only black people there. And he said, you're not going to leave me here by myself. I said, well, I'll stay a day till somebody, maybe some others will come. But it was a day and then 2 days. But he had planned a Bible study. And as most of these church conferences are, they're set in wonderful natural settings. Now, this was almost a Texas hill country, and it was called Lake Brownwood. And we sat on the hillside beside a lake and had Bible study every morning. And then we'd go there in the evening and watch the sunset. Well, it was almost like he picked Bible verses that would beat me up. Because, you did not choose me, I chose you, and appointed that you should go and bear fruit, and your fruit should abide. And it just seemed like every scripture he picked was beating me up. And and the other thing is, I had never met white people who really loved the Lord, that as I know it. Or we never talked about it. But almost all of these kids were kids from University of Texas or colleges around, Texas, and all of them said if my parents knew I was here, they would disown me. I said, well, why are you here? And they said, because I think this is what Jesus wants me to do. I said, you choose Jesus over your mom and daddy? And they paying your tuition? And I never met anybody. And then plus, almost all of them had some kind of calling. And they were thinking about serving others. They were thinking about being missionaries to India, teaching in some poor desperate community. And everybody seemed to have a calling or a purpose but me. And there again, why not me? And at the end of the conference, they asked for volunteers to, the idea was to unite the youth of America in a recommitment to Jesus Christ. And this was a nationwide program, and they wanted to have volunteers in each and every state. And there were no other black people there. So they looked at me and they said, we really want this to be integrated. And I said, well, And finally I said, well, I can volunteer for 6 months. And that'll give me time to figure out. Well, I ended up, again, I didn't know it, but the Lord had prepared me for that. Because when I got home, growing up in the Second World War, everybody had to buy saving stamps. You're all old enough to remember that. And we had to we had to pick up newspapers and sell them. We had to collect bottles. We had to collect coat hangers. And there was competition between the classes. And I was always wanting my class to win. So I hustled. And I had a lot of saving stamps. And somewhere along the line, my father, somebody came in to try to sell my father something called mutual funds. And I was just about 10, 11 years old. And they were talking about mutual funds and how much they paid. And I said, do they pay more than these war bonds? And he said, oh yeah, almost 2-3 times as much. And I said, can I swap my war bonds for a mutual fund? And I had about $200 worth of war bonds. Because they would give them to you for your birthday and stuff like that during the war. And so I bought mutual funds and forgot about it. Then when I told my daddy I was going to volunteer with this group and I was not going to dental school, it's the only time he ever got angry with me. And he was really heartbroken. And he said, well, all of the preachers I know are either poor or crooked. And I don't want you to be either. So I've done my part. I got you through college. You're on your own. Well, that was fine with me. And then my mother said, you remember those mutual funds you had? Because my daddy said he'd given me no more money. I was on my own. He paid my way through college. So, and it turned out that these, during the war, the stock market did good. And I think they were worth it had gone from $200 to $600 and something. And so I cashed them in, and I bought my first car, a $400 English Ford. And I took off for Connecticut. That's where they signed me. And I was working with a council of churches, and they were glad to have me, but they didn't realize that they were supposed to find a place for me to stay. And they didn't have any place for me to stay, so they called up Hartford Theological Seminary and asked if they had a spare room. And they said, yeah, he can stay in our guest room. And I went out to the seminary, and it was a nice place. I'd never been to a seminary before. And there were a lot of people coming back from the military, so there was nothing pious or seemingly religious. In fact, it was rowdier than my college. And I felt right at home. And, I said, well, if I'm going to be working with the churches in the evenings, church youth, they are not available till 4 or 5 o'clock. And so I walked into the dean's office and said, look, I'm working with the council of churches, and I really don't know anything about the Bible. I've read the Bible, I've been to Sunday school, but would it be possible for me to sit in on a New Testament and an Old Testament class? And the dean said, well, if you'll sit in on 3, I can give you a scholarship. And lo and behold, I ended up having a scholarship. And I not only sat in on 3 classes, but I really loved them. And it just so happened that the New Testament and the Old Testament professors were Quakers. And so that was sort of my first introduction to nonviolence. They had been pacifists during the war at a time when it wasn't popular. And my systematic theology professor was a young man who'd just gotten his PhD from St. Andrews in Scotland. And he and his wife had a little boy about the size of your grandson.
Yeah.
And they sort of took me in that when they were going out, they'd ask me to babysit. And they had a great big old, I forget, one of those spotted dogs that get on the Dalmatian. And so I would go running with this boy and the Dalmatian. And so I was in seminary. It was a completely new experience, but that seminary was just about 400 students, but 200 of them were missionaries from around the world. And the largest part was the College of Missions. And so you had missionaries coming back from all over the world. Now, that's very important because later on, skipping, that's where I learned foreign policy.
Really?
I learned about the world by talking to the missionaries. And I ended up staying in seminary. And but I had wanted to go to the Olympics. And I was on the track team in college and had done very well. And I signed up that first summer, to go to New York to train with the Pioneer Track Club. And I had a job with a settlement house. And what I didn't know was my mother, I had not been home. I had not been home for Christmas, Thanksgiving, Easter, and my mother was terribly worried about me. So she called our conference superintendent, again, without me knowing it, and said, can't you find a place to bring Andrew back south somewhere? So he said, I have just the place for him, which turned out to be Marion, Alabama, 30 miles from Selma. At the same time, the lady who was sort of the mother superior of that church was calling the same conference superintendent saying, look, we haven't had a summer pastor here to run a youth program for the last 5 years, and you got to send us somebody here now, or we're going to fold down. And by the way, try to send somebody young enough so that I can get rid of one of these 3 daughters I have.
And that is where you met Jean, right?
And so when I get there, I decided that that's why, I mean, first place, you know, my superintendent had to talk me out of New York. And he said, look, everybody wants to go to New York. And everybody wants to go to the Olympics. If you don't go there, somebody will go and they won't miss you. He said, if you don't go to Alabama, you'll be missed. I don't have anybody else to do that. Well, that was my criteria, that God had a purpose for you, and your purpose was something that nobody else wanted to do.
Did you love the church by then, or still kind of?
No, I guess I was understanding the mission of the church. I really loved the Bible, and I really loved the Lord, I think. Mm-hmm. And I was beginning to have a personal, I was beginning to understand what was going on inside me spiritually. But I still didn't want to be a pastor, and I didn't want much to do with the church. And
but you went from there and pastored in South Georgia too, right?
Well, only because of this lady. Because when I got there, that's when I knew the Lord had his eyes on me. Mm-hmm. Because I go in there and she wasn't home yet. There was a New Testament open, and it had been underlined. And I said, whose Bible? My daughter. Well, she'd underlined a lot of my favorite verses. Turns out she had been to Manchester College in Indiana, where one of the only places in the country that had a required course in New Testament nonviolence. It was Church of the Brethren College. And she had a senior life-saving certificate on the wall, and I'd been on the swimming team. And she had a basketball letter. And it turned out to be all the same daughter. And before she got home, I decided the Lord had sent me there to marry this woman.
Good call.
See? And but she didn't understand that. And she didn't like preachers. And when she got home and I first went to see her, she was milking a cow. And I thought it was the most beautiful sight in the world. And I went back to my car to get my camera, and she stopped milking, and she came toward me, and she said, the first word she said to me, if my mother didn't need this milk to make butter, I'd throw it all in your ugly, ignorant face.
Great start.
And I was in love. A woman who saw me as I really were. But anyway, it just worked out for a while. But all of that convinced me that I was on the right track. Mm-hmm. And so anywhere, anything that nobody else wanted to do, I was willing to do.
Then back up north for National Council of Churches, and then back to
and that's another story. We went up north for the National Council of Churches, and one of my jobs was television. Protestant churches had 13 weeks. Catholics had 13 weeks, and the Jewish community had what's left. But it was 10 o'clock every morning. CBS had a national television show that was available for the church to speak in non-traditional terms to young people. And that turned out to be my job as assistant producer for that. And I'm 25, you know, and so I'm working in national television, making money for the first time in my life. And we buy a house out in Queens. Then the sit-in story comes on, and we'd just been in the house not even a year. And we see John Lewis and Bernard Lafayette and all the things that were going on in the South. And this crazy woman, 8 months pregnant, and with our third child. And she's getting a master's at Queens College because tuition was only $16 a semester.
Wow.
So she could not afford not to get a master's degree. And she says, I'm ready to go back home. I said, we are home. We just bought this house. She said, no, home is south. I said, well, where are we going? She said, I don't know yet. But I said, well, what do you want me to do? She said, quit your job, sell this house. And I said, and then what? She said, I don't know, but you believe that the Lord has a purpose for your life, don't you? And I said, yeah. She said, well, trust him. Well, the last thing I wanted to do was get into SCLC with a bunch of Baptist preachers, because I'm a Congregationalist.
Yeah.
And we don't preach the same way most Southern Baptists preach. And so I was trying my best to stay away from Martin Luther King and SCLC. But after I accepted a job at a Highlander folk school in Tennessee and quit my job and sold my house, the state of Tennessee closed Highlander down. And here she was, a couple of weeks away from giving birth, and with no job, no house. And then the United Church of Christ says, well, we will, since SCLC could not take money from a foundation, they said, we have schools down at Dorchester, near Savannah, and we can fix up that school and you can do the training there that you were planning to do in Tennessee. And all of that, they worked that out, and I was on their payroll, but the best place to live was Atlanta, and the only space the office space was right across the hall from Martin Luther King.
In 1963, you became a part of SCLC, and then you were part of the Fraternity of Preachers, right? That's part of what I find interesting about this story is that the early days of the movement, almost all of you were preachers.
Oh, pretty much.
Jim Lawton was a Methodist, and you were a Congregationalist, but most of that crowd
were Baptist.
Were there any theological tensions discussing mud throwing in those days?
No, it was all ego battles.
Okay.
I mean, there was almost nothing theological. It was all ego and jockeying for, who's going to be on the left and the right of the Lord.
Well, who won the ego battles?
Huh?
Who won the ego battles?
Well, I guess I did. But only because I didn't battle.
Yeah.
I mean, I was not interested, and the way I got close to Martin Luther King was that I was in Atlanta, and his secretary said, look, your wife's in Alabama. She's just had a baby. It's going to be several months before she comes over. You're going to get in trouble if you're hanging around Atlanta. Can you help Dr. King with his mail? I said, sure. So she gave me a great big box of mail that he was receiving, and I was staying at the YMCA, Butler Street YMCA, and every night I'd stay up half the night trying to answer letters in the way I thought he would answer them. And I knew where he went to school, and I knew the books that he'd read. I'd read many of the same ones. And so I was trying to write like him. And he saw it and liked it and said, who's doing this? And that's how I got introduced to him. And he started then asking me, in fact, I was saying that I had been to Germany because I followed this young lady to a work camp in Germany in 1953 when he was invited to the European Baptist Convention. Since nobody else had been to Europe, he said, why don't you go with me? And you at least have a passport and have been to Europe. By that time, I'd been 3 or 4 times. And so we met Dr. Graham. And that was one of the things that I saw that was, I'll never forget, that here's Martin Luther King, 5 feet 6, 7, Billy Graham, 6'3" or 4, and he comes over and he talks to Dr. King and says, I really am glad to see you. I wanted to congratulate you on your courageous prophetic ministry. And Dr. King said, well, Dr. Graham, I want you to know that we know that our prophetic ministry is only possible because of your equally courageous pastoral ministry. And if you were not pastoring white Christians in the South, we wouldn't have the response that we're getting. And they hit it off almost immediately.
Oh, wow.
And that's what sort of put me close to Billy Graham, because later on, when we built he had not had a thoroughly integrated revival in the South. And I don't know what I was doing, but I helped the Graham organization bring the black preachers together with the white preachers, and we had one of the first completely integrated revivals in the South. We had another one when we opened the dome. And the reason for that was, in order to build that first dome, I had to tear down 3 little churches. Now I was mayor then. And I said that one of the reasons why I felt we could do that, I said that we'll have one revival here and we'll reach more people than you all will in a decade. And so in following up on that, we got Dr. Graham to come back. We had another revival here, and we had another one to kick off our Olympic bid. And so we had a very close relationship with the Graham organization.
I've been interested in the role of the white church in the civil rights movement. Point of pride for me, in 1958, a group of 80 white Baptist ministers, or white ministers rather, in the city of Atlanta took out a full-page ad in the AJC promoting tolerance, conversation. It would be cautious language today, but for its day, it was pretty bold.
No, that was very good, yeah.
Yeah, and my predecessor, Monroe Swilley, was one of the 80 names who took that bold step. I'm proud of that. A few years later, 1963, the Birmingham Herald had a full-page ad put out by a bunch of white ministers. And in that ad, they denounced Dr. King and blamed you and the rest of those rabble-rousers for causing all this trouble. So where did the white clergy help and hurt the cause you were advancing?
Well, they actually helped in Birmingham, because when we went to Birmingham, there had been 60 unsolved bombings of black people's homes in Birmingham, and we didn't even get it in the newspapers over here. And Fred Shuttlesworth's church was bombed for the 3rd time on December 17, 1962. And he came over and said, look, we cannot just sit by and be passively nonviolent. If you're going to preach this nonviolence, you've got to come over to Birmingham, and we'll sit here and we'll all get killed, being nonviolent. So that was a challenge to nonviolence that Dr. King could not refuse. And but even though those ministers took out that ad, when we first went there, he asked me, did I know any white people in Birmingham? And I remembered that there had been a delegation at one of these international conferences, and I didn't remember the lady's name, but I called the Episcopal Diocesan House, which was located not like this big church across the street, but they had a big facility where the bishop stayed. And I asked, could I set up a meeting with the bishop and Dr. King, and they agreed, and we started meeting there almost every day. I would be part of the demonstrations in the morning, and then I'd put on a shirt and tie and I'd go down to the Episcopal Diocesan House, and they would invite a few businessmen or a few clergy. And so we had the dialogue going, and So we almost didn't pay much attention to that whole page ad, except that Dr. King was in jail. And it hurt him. And he wrote an answer to that ad, which turned out to be the letter from the Birmingham jail. And he wrote it around the margins of the New York Times because he didn't have any paper. And then when he finished, he didn't have any more space. Fortunately, Birmingham jails have tough toilet paper because he finished it on toilet paper.
Wow.
And it turned out to be, well, it almost like one of the letters of Paul written in jail. And nothing focuses your attention like being in jail. And he would fast whenever he went to jail. And for him, going to jail was a kind of a spiritual experience.
Were you in jail any?
No, I didn't. They wouldn't let me go to jail because I had to. They said my role was the Uncle Tom. I had to go suck up to the white folks. And that's the way it was described. But it was not a problem for me because I grew up in New Orleans, and it's almost like I was born for this because I was born in the middle of a block right downtown off Canal Street, and there was an Irish grocery store on one corner, an Italian bar on another. The Nazi party was on the third corner, and they were Heiling Hitler. And so my daddy had to explain white supremacy to me when I was like 3 or 4 years old. And I thought of that with your grandson. At that age, my daddy was kind of tapping me in the face. And if I'd get mad and fight back at him, he'd slap me hard. He said, see, you don't ever lose your temper in a fight. If you lose your temper in a fight, what happens was the blood rushes from your head to your fists and your feet, and you're not going to be big enough to beat anybody. So you better stay cool and outthink and think with anybody. If you use your mind instead of your fists, you win more battles than you will fighting or running. And so that was sort of beaten into me from kindergarten.
Wow.
And so, and again, I lived in that neighborhood until I was about 16, till I went away to college. And all of those folk became my friends, one way or another. They closed down the Nazi Party headquarters when the war started.
You said you couldn't understand your life without the spiritual dimension, but were there times in the movement when you saw so much violence and so much hatred that your faith got shaken?
Not at all. Because again, my grandmother lost her sight when she was 80. And I was about 6, 7, 8. And I had to read the newspaper and the Bible every day when I came home from school. That was my job. And she prayed to die. I mean, she would argue with God, why are you keeping me here? And she'd recite all of the suffering she'd had, all of the things she's been through. And she said, I'm ready to come on home to glory. And so death was never something that I was afraid of. And Martin Luther King was the same way, that he would laugh and joke about death. And he knew that death was imminent for him. And even in Birmingham in 1963, one of the reporters came over to me and said, now, Andy, I know you all don't like the cameramen getting in the way of the marches, but I got to keep a camera on Dr. King, because if he gets shot and I don't have a picture of it, I'll lose my job. And it was just one of the realities that we sort of took for granted. And he would always say that, yeah, it's gonna be rough in Birmingham, but I know they're after me. But you all are always jumping in front of me trying to get your picture in the paper. So he said, you'll probably end up taking a bullet for me, one of you, and he'll pick somebody different out every time. And he said, but I think I can preach you into heaven.
Well, I never read this anywhere, but Taylor Branch was saying to me at lunch Sunday, he said that you all would pick on each other about death and role play preaching each other's funerals.
Well, he did all the preaching at the funeral.
He preached. What was that like?
It was like a comedy act. It was more like a Eddie Murphy or a Richard Pryor. You know, he didn't use the profanity, but he would always describe the worst thing he could think of you doing. And
you want to tell the worst thing he could think of you doing?
well, I forgot.
I don't think Cassandra believed that, by the way.
No, but I think the sort of thing, whatever he thought your weaknesses were, he would exaggerate them, and present them to God. Said, but he meant well. So, Lord, please forgive him.
Please.
But he did it in good old Baptist preach very, Lord. I mean, he had a hoop to it.
Oh, yeah.
See, and he would he never preached like that very much, but he was like an old-fashioned stump Baptist preacher in the country, you know, pooping you into heaven.
That's great. Well, one of the other interesting things Taylor Branch said to me at lunch that I hadn't thought about before, he said that the movement was really driven by women, but that the men had the microphone. Was that related to the role of women in the culture at that time, or was there something in the black church at that time that kind of informed that?
Women always ran the South. I think that's true of black and white women, but they never got the microphone. But for instance, my being in Atlanta came because Gene insisted that we come back to Georgia. And I mean, when we first went down to Thomasville and had our first encounter with the Klan, I mean, she was really picking on me. And I had read Reinhold Niebuhr, and the World War II theology was not pacifist. And so I said, if the Klan comes to get us, I'm going to go out and talk to them, because I wouldn't run from them. And I said, but I want you to sit up in the window with a rifle. And she said, I can't do that. I said, why? You're a good shot. I said, you're a much better shot than me. She said, yeah, but I can't point a gun at a human being. I said, you talking about the Ku Klux Klan? She said, and you're a preacher. I said, what's that got to do with it? She said, well, if you ever forget that under that sheet is the heart of a child of God, you need to quit preaching.
Wow.
And I said, wait a minute, woman, come on. I mean, these people can throw, I mean, it doesn't even have to be a dynamite stick. It could be a cigarette butt on this trashy house we're in now, and it would go up in smoke. And you got, a 3-month-old baby up there, and me and you. She said, so? I said, so, what do you mean? She said, don't you preach about the cross and the resurrection? I said, what's that got to do with it? She said, if you don't believe it, you need to quit preaching, and we need to find something else to do. Wow. And so there was that kind of uncompromising faith. And Coretta was that way too. Coretta's house was burned down when she was 15. And when she came home from choir practice, her daddy was there waiting. And he had them all kneel down and thank God that they were not in the house. And then he asked God to forgive the sick people that bombed their house, and not to let his children harbor any bitterness or hatred in their heart. And so you had that. And see, Gene's family had a lot of property after the Reconstruction. And they had 4 stores right on the main street in Marion. And something happened, and they found a way in the 40s to take that property away from her family. And her grandfather committed suicide. And her father became an alcoholic because all of his business, his life was destroyed. And her mother was a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse, but the white superintendent tried to make advances toward her. And instead of saying, "Me too," she hit him upside the head with an umbrella. And she got fired and couldn't teach in that county. So from about 13 to 17, Jean was having to come home from school and help fix dinner for her father and, do things for her mother, because her mother had to drive 40 miles each way to another county to teach. And so, they had experienced the bitterness and the pain of racism. Growing up in New Orleans, I was protected, and Martin Luther King was protected pretty much here in Atlanta. But in the rural South, it could be very, very hard.
But a family getting on their knees, asking God to forgive somebody who just did violence to them, that ethic is born out of the Christian faith. That's church-taught stuff.
Yeah.
So where is the role of the church in this movement going forward?
Well, the role is to realize that that this is probably the most complex time in the history of humanity. We've had more advances in technology. I say that I have a sermon that I preach about the printing press. And in 1500, when the printing press came out, it took literally 500 years. You had a 100-year war in Europe when the King James Version, 1611, was printed in England. You had the Baptists, the Congregationalists, the Methodists, the Episcopalians breaking off from the Anglican Church, and they all came here to the United States and founded the United States basically because they wanted to read the Bible like they wanted to, or like they thought God wanted them to. And so it was the church that kind of created the United States of America out of trying to deal with the changes in life that was brought on by the printing press. And I say that it really took 2 world wars and Franklin Roosevelt and the United Nations and the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund in the 50s to get the world back together. And it sort of stayed together pretty well until about 74. And that was when I was in Congress, and that was when everybody was talking about the impeachment of Richard Nixon, but in the banking committee, they were reorganizing the world economy. And I was on the banking committee because somehow mass transit got onto banking as urban affairs. And even though I didn't know anything about banking, we were building MARTA. So I tried to get on the committee where we were dealing with mass transit. And so I was in those meetings where the structured world that took 500 years to put together, they were restructuring financially. And now we got to go through all this all over again because of the cell phone and the internet. And if you think the printing press caused some trouble, you got to tighten your seatbelt, because it's hell to pay from here on in. And the role of the church is to proclaim the word of the Lord in the midst of all of the chaos and confusion. That we might disagree on, say, guns, but we might disagree on health care. We might disagree on a lot of things, but what is the faith that we can agree on that will bind this nation together and help us bind the world together? Now, I'll put this in because everything I was talking about kind of was happening in Atlanta in a different way. Because unlike Birmingham or Selma or the rest of the South, the business community in Atlanta got together and decided that they were going to be a city too busy to hate. And so that's what made us different. And when Jimmy Carter got to be governor, he was running as a peanut farmer. Because of the wars in Vietnam and Korea and the conflict that he knew about, he didn't say that he was a nuclear physicist. But he probably knew more about nuclear warfare than any president we've had, because he was the deputy to Admiral Rickover, who created the nuclear navy. Now, he also was born in a county that was 80% black. So he was really very, very comfortable with people who were different. And he practiced what I call the politics of respect. And people saw him as a Sunday school teacher, but he took his theology to the White House. And we did not have a single American soldier killed in war while he was president, and no American soldier killed anybody. And we had a treaty with the Russians to sort of disarm, take down some of the nuclear weapons. We got Israel, he got Israel and Egypt together. We settled the Panama Canal Treaty and also the Southern Africa, because he didn't tell people what to do. He asked them, when he sent me to Africa, he said, I want you to ask African leaders what they expect of this administration and how can we help them. And I not only went to the black Africans, when I went to South Africa, I'd been to South Africa a couple of times before, and they wanted me to see the black leaders, and I said, no. I said, I need to see the white leaders. I said, who is the meanest, hard-shell guy you got? And they said, he's the defense minister. I said, well, can I talk to him? Well, why do you want to talk to him? I said, because President Carter told me to ask African leaders. I know what the black leaders are going to tell me. I don't have any idea what he might say, and I need to bring my report back. And so he agreed to see me. And I got a really serious understanding. I mean, he was very blunt. And he said, you were congressman. White people voted for you. I said, I guess so. He said, why? And I said, I guess they figured we had to learn to live together one day, and they got along with me pretty well. And I mean, Ivan Allen particularly, I'd helped settle the garbage worker strike, and I think his assistant was here. I just met
in the room tonight. Yeah.
And I said, we've worked together to solve problems, and we're getting pretty good at it. And he said, And the next question was, how many people are into marrying? I said, well, some, but really not that much. I said, I see occasional interracial couples, but there's no wholesale everybody getting married to everybody just because the world's changing. And he grunted again. And the third question was, he said, how long do you think we'll have before the bloodbath? I said, what bloodbath? He said, surely these black people are going to rise up and kill us all one day. And I said, I don't think so. He said, how can you say that? And I said, well, most of the black leaders that I know went to the same kind of missionary schools that Martin Luther King went to. And I said, I know Desmond Tutu. He wasn't a bishop then. I said, he's that way. And I called the names of specific leaders that he knew, and I talked to him about their Christian background. Mm-hmm. And I also had proof. I said, remember, Gandhi was here in South Africa. And he went back to England, and they ended colonialism, and I don't think a single Englishman was killed. Wow. See? And I said, that's what President Carter wants to say. He wants to find a way to help you out of this situation, because it can't last forever. But nobody wants to kill anybody. They want to learn to live together as brothers. And I quoted Dr. King, or rather than perish together as fools. Yeah.
You have been so remarkably generous with your time. I have one final question. Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I reread your spiritual memoir this week in preparation. 14 years ago, you wrote, and you dedicated that book to those who seek the way amid the questions, conflict, and confusion of our time. Where do you see pockets of people who are seeking the way, getting it right, and what kind of model and inspiration for that can we find?
The best one was the march last weekend, a couple of weeks ago, when there were 1 million people that came out of Parkland, Florida, and mobilized the nation about guns. And the thing is, they were not bitter, and they were not saying people couldn't have guns, but they were just saying that there's no place for automatic weapons in civilized society. And it was focused, it was really civil. It was civil disobedience at its best. And I think that these young people are children of the cell phone age. They were born, it might have been a mistake that I'll regret, but I guess it was about five years ago. I bought all 8 of my grandchildren iPads. Well, even a 1-year-old. And they put it in a foam rubber case, and it's his favorite toy, except for baseball now. But I don't know how these young people are going to control the world, but they are smarter, they have more experience, they have more money, and they have an uncanny kind of, and I think it's religious wisdom. They might not want to define it in Christian terms yet, but I wouldn't be surprised that if you talk to many of them privately, it would be specifically religious questions. And, like Gene said to me, and Martin used to say, that there's no remission of sins without the shedding of innocent blood. And those kids have the blood of 17 classmates that I think right now put great sadness in their hearts. But I think they've been baptized in the blood of the Lamb. And I don't know where it'll take them, but it's brought me pretty safe thus far. And I was saying, and I probably need to say that we did not know what we were doing. Almost everything we used to say, God, you take one step, God will take two. And we went to Birmingham with no money. We had a plan that somebody wrote up, but nothing worked out like it was planned. But everything worked out. And in Birmingham, nobody got killed until afterwards. And same thing with Selma. Except that the March of Bloody Sunday was on the wrong day. That was a leap year, and all the preachers had to be in their pulpits on the first Sunday, and that turned out to be the 7th of March. And the march was scheduled for the second Sunday, and Dr. King and none of the preachers were there. And 300 people showed up on the wrong day. Now the thing is, if Dr. King had been there, President Johnson would have had, you know, he would have had the Justice Department, and he would have been, he had a lot of respect for Martin Luther King, and he would have taken extra precautions to keep him safe. But because Dr. King wasn't there, they thought, you know, nobody would pay any attention to these poor country folk walking across the bridge. And they got beat up. I don't think anybody got killed then, but they got beat up on a Sunday afternoon when it was cold and rainy all over the north, and when the most powerful thing playing on television was Judgment at Nuremberg. And so all of the people who were looking at the savagery and sadistic behavior of the Nazis in Germany were watching television, and then you break to that and you see Selma. And that's why all of these white people came down. And you had bishops, and the Archbishop of the Greek Orthodox Church, Rabbi Heschel, who was probably one of the foremost authorities on the prophets of the Old Testament, Ralph Bunche from the UN. I mean, it got a national response to Selma, Alabama. And you could not plan that.
Right.
See? So the problem I have now is I still expect to live that way. Because I don't know exactly what we're doing. And we never did in Atlanta. But, I mean, the Olympics was another miraculous thing, which I only hooked into because I wanted to go to the Olympics when I was in school, and I didn't get to go. And when Billy Payne came, you know, I responded mainly because here was a guy who had had a heart attack at 34. And then as a result of his heart attack, football player at Georgia, you know, did very well in the real estate business in the Buckhead boom, and then has a heart attack and gets involved in his church. And he helps to rebuild a new sanctuary for out there in Dunwoody. And he comes home and he says to his wife, "This is the first time I think I've ever done anything that really makes me feel good about myself. I wish there was one more thing I could do like this before I die." Now, I also found out that his father died in his early 40s. So here's a kid now, 37. His father died, and he's talking about bringing the Olympics because a movie shows up on television after he comes from the Dunwoody church. That's the way the Lord works. The Lord might knock you down with a heart attack to get your attention, but once he gets you, you know, he can use you. So I decided that the Lord wanted us to have the Olympics. And then the AIB was here, and William Womack, who played the piano for them, his wife brought me a little book with all of the countries and how you apply for the Olympics. And when I read it, there were 85 countries. And I knew somebody in 55 of them. And I figured we can do that. We got 53 votes. Wow. But all of these, to me, are divine accidents. And we raised $2.5 billion no government money in the Olympics. We end up with $100 million left over, and 41% of all of the business goes to minority and female-owned companies. And people say, well, isn't that too much? Well, no, because we got the Olympics, that was 40% of $2 billion, but there was another $10 billion that was coming in from other places that the city didn't have anything to say about. See, so minorities only got, of all this building going on around here, we probably only have maybe 10, 12% minority and female-owned companies. But if it hadn't been for a successful Olympics where we worked together, we probably wouldn't have all this growth and development now. Now, maybe that's too much, and I don't know how we're going to stop it, but...
Well, the church, the clergy and the church 50 years ago were a big part of moving this conversation forward, and I hope our churches and our clergy today will be the same.
I don't know whether you were here yet, but we got 1,000 churches together when we went to bid for the Olympics. Mm-hmm. And we did that because the Korean churches did it. And it was a case of reverse missionaries. I saw them having 1,000 churches involved, praying for good weather, praying for peace with North Korea, and praying for a successful Olympics. And so as soon as we came back having won the Olympics, we got all the pastors together, and we had about 1,000 churches that were working in our Olympics. The Olympics succeeded because I think we had 140,000 volunteers. Ooh. Or we couldn't have done it. See? And those volunteers were recruited in our churches, and those churches opened up to people from other countries. And it was a witness of world Christianity. They didn't want to publicize it, but we also got together with UNICEF, and we were able to stop wars in 37 different places around the world. Wow. And we raised independent money for UNICEF to go in and immunize children on both sides. And we didn't have any money to do that, but we went to Garth Brooks. And Garth Brooks said, well, my schedule is such that I can't do anything, but can I give you a check? And he wrote a check for $1 million to get us started on what we called the Olympic truce, to immunize children against diseases. And so all of that's very, very New Testament oriented.
Mm-hmm. On a lot of Sundays here, I get so full of what we're a part of that I say to our congregation that I feel sorry for anybody who's not us. And tonight, I feel sorry for anybody who didn't show up and become a part of this conversation. Would you thank our guests? And if you will all stand, and let me close us with a prayer, and our evening will be dismissed. Let's pray together. For the giants who went before us, O God, we give you thanks. Even when they thought they were stumbling, they were following the way. We pray for your guidance, your deliverance, and forgiveness. Might we all in this room be part of the way forward for the cause of Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Very good.
What a wonderful gift to us. Wonderful.